Hello, I'm Sarah Watson, Director of the Murphy Institute at CUNY SLU. Thank you all for joining us today for When a Black Man Attempts to Become a Man, Black Masculinities, and the 20th Century Black Freedom Struggle, a guest lecture by DeWeston Haywood, Associate Professor of History at Hunter College. This lecture is organized in dialogue with the film screenings we hosted this February, including the 2003 documentary, Brother Outsider, The Life of Bayard Rustin, and the 2016 documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, based on James Baldwin's unfinished manuscript, Remember This House. This program is organized by the Murphy Institute and Student and Community Affairs at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and it's part of our LGBTQIA+ consortium programming and is made possible through the generous support of LaGuardia Community College and the New York City Council LGBT and Queer Caucus. This program is co-sponsored by the Black Male Initiative Leadership Program at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. Before I introduce DeWeston, I want to thank my colleagues who worked on today's program, Michael, Nadia, and Rose from the Public Engagement Team, and Rochelle, Kevin, and Pharaoh King from Student and Community Affairs and the Black Male Initiative Leadership Program. Following DeWeston's lecture, we'll have an opportunity for audience Q&A. We ask that folks share their questions using the Zoom Q&A function, and my colleague Michael Alon will then share the questions out to DeWeston. Additionally, SLU students and alumni attending today's event will receive a free copy of DeWeston's book, Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press and a Manly Vision for Racial Advancement. To obtain your copy, please email events@slu.cuny.edu and put DeWeston Haywood book as your subject line. Also include your name, SLU program, email address, and phone number. And this information I just shared is also being shared out in the chat. I had the opportunity to meet Professor DeWeston Haywood when I worked at Hunter College prior to coming to SLU, and it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce him here today. DeWeston is a historian of 20th century American history with research and teaching interests in Black protest, protest thought, Black masculinity, Black power, and the intersections of Black culture, Black politics, and Black public spheres. His first book, Let Us Make Men, the 20th Century Black Press and a Manly Vision for Racial Advancement, reinterprets the Black press as a tool for Black men's leadership, public vocalization, gender and identity formation, and space for the construction of ideas of proper Black masculinity that shaped the 20th century Black freedom struggle to wage a fight for racial justice and Black manhood. Welcome, DeWeston, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for the invitation to speak with all of you today. So in light of the documentaries you screened, I want to take some time to contextualize those men, Baldwin and Rustin, in the broader intellectual, social, political, and gendered milieu in which they operated. So the title of my talk today actually comes from James Baldwin, words he uttered as a guest on the Dick Cavett show in 1969, popular show at the moment, that was featured in the documentary that you looked at, I Am Not Your Negro. And it was the moment that a defensive Baldwin was trying to explain himself to another invited guest, a white male professor of philosophy at Yale, Paul Weiss, who had said to Baldwin, quote, "Why all this emphasis on Black and white? Shouldn't the emphasis be on the struggle to become a full man?" End quote. And the very ever insightful Baldwin responded, quote, "I was discussing the real danger of death thrown up by this society when a Black man attempts to become a man," end quote. So Baldwin was not cavalier with his words. He was, I think, surgical with words, and his use of attempt is striking to me. And I think Paul Weiss, the philosopher he was speaking with, was concerned that Baldwin was putting too much emphasis on race and doing it to the exclusion of what he thought were more pressing matters of being and existence. That if we're talking about race, then somehow we're not talking about manhood, right? And if we're talking about manhood, then somehow we're not talking about race. For Weiss, race was an outlier. or subordinate to larger issues of manhood that pointed, he thought, to even larger issues of being and human existence. For Baldwin and many other Black men of his moment, not to mention many white men, race and manhood were inseparable. They were mutually constitutive of the other. And both men, Baldwin and Weiss, also hit upon this other point, critical to, I think, what we might call the riddle of race and gender. This idea of becoming, right? That one becomes a man or not, suggests that there is a contested and fraught process of making a man, of cultivating manhood and masculinity, even as one might be born with male equipment, right? So becoming a man is to admit that race and gender are not natural states of being as much as they are constructed ones, right? We make and unmake over space and over time and over ideologies that emerge and fracture accordingly. And so my book, Let Us Make Men, wrestled with these points among many others. I wrote it to uncover the gender dimensions of Black political thought, organizing, and resistance, which, as I argue, called for a vision and application of proper Black manhood in order to achieve proper citizenship and the rights thereof, calls that were critical to the success and limits of the 20th century Black freedom struggle. And so I found that this masculine discourse was both empowering and problematic, and it emerged in mass from a pretty well-known and powerful source, but still this unassuming quotidian source, right? Black newspapers and their publishers. And so by foregrounding the discursive and ideological work of Robert Abbott, who published The Chicago Defender, W.E.B. Du Bois, who published The Crisis, Marcus Garvey, The Negro World, Robert F. Williams, The Crusader, and Malcolm X, Muhammad Speaks, I show how and why it was the Black press that shaped the 20th century Black freedom struggle to wage both a fight for racial justice and Black manhood, that the two were inseparable and constitutive of the other. So I thought, let's reinterpret the Black press, right? We know this well-known source as a source of news about Black people, especially at times when white medias resisted any honest coverage of Black people. But what if this source was also not only a source of news, but also a source of our gendered identities? What if Black men utilize the press to vocalize themselves to the public in order to articulate a certain gendered identity rooted in ideas of value, humanness, and citizenship? We know the Black press well as this organizer and mobilizer of Black people through various editorial campaigns, the most famous of which was the Double V campaign of the 1940s, right? But what if the Black press was also an organizer and mobilizer of crises intended to motivate Black men to stand up and be men, right? And if so, what did being a man mean? What did it entail? And what were their contributions and costs to the long Black freedom struggle if Black people fully embraced and acted on these gendered identities constructed and promoted by popular Black newspapers and their publishers? So this is what I get at in the book, Let Us Make Men. And ultimately, the Black press in particular and the press in general work to socialize and politicize readers into a gendered subjectivity. That is, Black men were socialized and politicized into the proper masculine selves in order to achieve racial justice. The newspapers that led this quest for proper Black manhood sat at the complex intersections of gender ideology, race, class, identity, urbanization, the public sphere, Black institutional life, and Western practices of nation, state, and citizenship. And all of these things influenced and shaped the discourses these papers promoted, for better and for worse. So to be clear, though, there were different models of manhood, and these models shifted over time. They shifted based on region. What counted as proper Black masculinity in Chicago in 1919, for example, during the Chicago race riots, did not count for example, in Montgomery in 1955. So sometimes there were multiple models of Black masculinity competing at the same time. And this is where the Black press was crucial. It could turn an idea of manhood into an ideal of manhood. It could promote one model over all the others and help to make that one model the model, right, over all the others, though the others never really disappear. So these processes of led to, of course, consensus, contestations, conflicts, contradictions, so that the vision for racial advancement was at times democratic and at times patriarchal, radical, at times conservative, liberating, and at other times limiting. And so we might be able to distill all of these points into a few fundamental questions, I think. Why is gender so central to our conceptions of the political, to organizing and political engagement, and claims we make on the state? And why is the state capable of only recognizing us as worthy political actors or subjects if we make our claims in a gendered or racialized vein, even as one of those veins might negate the other? This is part of what Baldwin was saying to Weiss, that if you put Black in front of man, they cancel the other out, right? Why does masculinity and gender writ large remain our default metric of value? That is, when people try to claim value, humanity, rights, in different forms of power before the state, they have historically tapped into gender, stating, for example, as some Black men did in the 1960s, I am a man. As some Black women did in the early 20th century, late 19th, aren't I a woman, right? And these are just two examples, right? But you see the framework in which they're articulating humanist citizenship and rights. And this is done in order to become recognized and legible in front of Western frameworks. And of course, these visions of proper manhood and womanhood become fundamental to political thought and organizing in both empowering and problematic ways, whether we're Black or white and beyond, right? And this is where we find James Baldwin and Beard Rustin. Though precisely because of gender, we also find them at times outside, at times directly in dialogue, and then at other times betwixt, liminal, marginal, and at other times utterly dismissed. Right. So allow me to briefly foreground some of the chapters of the book in order to situate these men historically and why they got locked out, but also how they nonetheless, I think, carved out a space, an interstitial one, to contribute to the masculine discourses of their political and historical moments. So the book starts with the first Great Migration, the period of the 1910s when tens of thousands of Black people left the South for the North as refugees, fleeing racial violence and economic and political powerlessness. One historian has called this period the nadir of race relations, that it was the lowest point in race relations because the Jim Crow regime had crushed Black political power and participation. It reversed the rights and freedoms of Black people that they gained during Reconstruction during the mid to late 1860s and into the 1870s. And Jim Crow laws stripped many Black men of their right to vote and controlled their time and controlled their labor. These were rights that were considered sacred for men in a patriarchal society and sacred also in Western political, legal, and social frameworks. And as a result, this nadir in race relations touched off a nadir in gender relations, in which white people considered Black people less than human and also less than real men and real women, both often expressed in the same vein. And so situated in the North, where it was somewhat safer to attack Jim Crow laws and the regime, as Black political organizing crystallized in the early 20th century, the Crisis magazine and the Chicago Defender responded to these developments by encouraging Black people to leave the South, what led to the Great Migration. But the Chicago Defender in particular put it this way, quote, "It is time to act. And every man that has a spark of manhood or race loyalty about him will join this national movement to better conditions for our people. Let every man and woman who reads this message carry it into every nook and corner of this broad but not free land. It is now or never. Let your voice join the chorus of thousands who answer, I will. Walk out from your jobs that rob you of your manhood or womanhood. Be men, quit your job, make your own destiny. End quote. That was 1915. So the Defender promoted the Great Migration as the first step it saw any Black man could take to begin restoring their manhood, helping engender this major social movement in Black people, a literal migration, just moving to and fro, right? But moving to and fro for individual and racial manhood, in addition to political and economic freedom. So this framing of the migration as a movement toward manhood deploy gendered terms that gain wide traction, terms that the Black press would continue to use throughout the 20th century to discuss pressing racial issues for Black men's public vocalization and for mobilizing Black people to action. And again, hundreds of thousands of Black people fled the South at this time for the urban North and Midwest. And so illuminating the gendered thinking behind the movement helps illuminate the complexities of migrants' motivations, right? Let's take Marcus Garvey by the 1920s as our next example during the famed Harlem Renaissance. Garvey was a Jamaican-born activist and leader. He led the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, the largest mass movement of Black people in American history, with upwards of 4 million members. Founded in 1914 in Jamaica, it was headquartered in Harlem in 1916 when Garvey migrated to Harlem. And Garvey wanted followers to build Black businesses that would lead to an independent African nation and Black empire, so he thought. But one of the ways he appealed to followers, one of the ways he grew his popularity and built, again, the largest mass movement of Black people in America was through this deeply gendered language. He said, quote, "The time has come when the Negro must take his stand as a man. If the white man is manly enough to put up a factory, the Negro ought to be manly enough to do the same thing. The Negro would be less than a man if he does not." End quote. Garvey, like other men of his moment, believed that a virile Black masculinity validated and valorized Black entrepreneurship, taking something that by all accounts belong to a question of markets, right, and labor, to ground that argument instead also in a question of manhood. And again, his movement attracted upwards of 4 million members. And we see these kinds of discourses in politics play out again and again, decade after decade, region after region, crisis after real and perceived crisis, empowering and problematizing the Black freedom struggle, even as these discourses in politics also changed over time, well into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. We see this again with the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. The modern civil rights movement turned on critical questions of race, rights, resistance, justice, protest, yet also manhood. This is especially exemplified by differences between two activists based in the same region, the South, though from different states. Martin Luther King Jr., coming out of Montgomery, Alabama, and then Robert F. Williams, who was based in Monroe, North Carolina. And so both men were civil rights activists committed to fighting for racial justice. Both men differed over strategy, however. King, as many of you know, believed in nonviolent protest in the face of attack. Williams, on the other hand, was a veteran who had served in the Korean War. He believed in Black self-defense and armed resistance in the face of attack. Both men argued over the merits of their strategies in deeply gendered terms. So in 1959, after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, Williams published an article titled, quote, "Is Violence Necessary to Combat Injustice? For the positive, Williams says we must fight back," end quote. Williams was prompted to write the peace because he and King and the nonviolent civil rights establishment had gone back and forth in the press for several years over the merits of their tactics. In fact, Williams was the president of his local chapter of the NAACP based in Monroe, North Carolina, and he had been suspended in 1957 by the NAACP's national leadership based in New York for advocating Black self-defense. And so Williams, the ex-Marine, had this to say, quote, "Negroes must be willing to defend themselves, their women, their children, and their homes. Men who violently and swiftly rise to oppose tyranny are virtuous examples to emulate. I have been taught by my government to fight. Nowhere in the annals of history does the record show a people delivered by bondage, delivered from bondage, rather, by patience alone." End quote. King clapped back. He argued, quote, "Pure nonviolence requires extraordinary discipline and courage. Williams would have us believe that there is no collective and practical alternative. There is more power in socially organized masses on the march than there is in guns in the hands of a few desperate men." End quote. So here's an instance of multiple models of Black masculinity competing at the same time and competing essentially from the same region, the South, though they're coming from different states and cities. Montgomery, Alabama for King, Monroe, North Carolina for Williams. In fact, Monroe, North Carolina was also one of the regional headquarters for the KKK. And of course, the KKK used violence to terrorize and assault Black residents there as it did across the country. And so we can imagine what motivated Williams, in addition to, him being a veteran, but he feels like he's behind enemy lines, right? Having been trained by the U.S. military to defend himself and sort of seeing it in that kind of framework. But it was going to be the Black press, Black newspapers that helped decide which model would prevail as the model, as the image of proper Black manhood, the armed, self-defensive Black man, or the nonviolent activist whose strength came not from weapons, but from his courage to accept attack and not retaliate. And it was Bayard Rustin that helped put together for King the rebuttal to Williams. To be sure, King was not fully committed to nonviolence, at least not privately, at the beginning of his public career, when the boycott began in December of 1955. At first, King was skeptical of nonviolence and as an all-encompassing philosophy and strategy. So when segregationists bombed his home on January 30th, 1956, King had armed men guard his home at night. King also purchased a firearm following the incident. But it was Rustin, the veteran organizer, had been an organizer for 20 years by the time he met King. He was a Quaker, a pacifist, and so he mentored King for several years, right? Teaching him to embrace nonviolence, not just as a protest tactic, right? But as a philosophy, as a way of life, as a way of being. And so under Rustin's mentorship, King had this to say in gendered terms in other publications, right? Quote, "We have discovered a new and powerful weapon, nonviolent resistance. Through forced separation from our African culture, through slavery, poverty, and deprivation, many Black men lost self-respect. Negroes lost faith in themselves and came to believe that perhaps they really were what they had been told they were, something less than a man. But we Negroes have replaced self-pity with self-respect and self-deprecation with dignity through nonviolent protest." End quote. So King's method attracted followers. But the Black press also promoted King with loads of positive coverage. In fact, one veteran Black journalist and writer for several Black newspapers who had been a journalist for about 30 years by the time King comes along, this veteran journalist was fired from one newspaper when he published a few pieces that were critical of King. But Bayard Rustin received no positive coverage, right? He was sidelined and marginalized from the leadership and broader influence he deserved because he was openly gay. Women activists were also pushed aside from major leadership positions and influence as leadership became a category, a space, a role reserved for men only, partly in hopes that that role would present a proper image to the public. That this was and this was the case no matter what decade we sort of drop in on, but a certain kind of man who inhabited the kind of masculinities deemed proper at the time. So as for Rustin, opponents of the movement threatened to go public with a threadbare lie that the close mentoring relationship between King that he had with King was a romantic one, right? King distanced himself, and Rustin receded into a new role, one situated in the background to be sure, but Rustin, being the brilliant, resistant political organizer and theorist that he was, he utilized this background role to mobilize from the background, to strategize, to organize, and criticize. Right? So in many ways, Rustin was increasingly everywhere and nowhere at once by the 1960s. He was working behind the scenes as he remained committed to the goal of achieving racial justice, even if it meant sacrificing himself in a more public leadership role. James Baldwin did not escape these politics either, even though he had mostly resigned himself to being less involved as an activist in marches and street, was more concerned instead with being what he thought of as an active witness. So you could say that, much like Rustin, he adopted a background strategy role, but unlike Rustin, who was directly involved, King as well directly involved in those kinds of protests, Baldwin he elected to play this role of the documentarian, the writer who is documenting, explaining the freedom struggle in letters and to audiences from the strategic position of the witness, right? So Baldwin chose that role, whereas Rustin was essentially forced into it. In many ways, Malcolm X was working in the same capacity. And what Baldwin and Malcolm X realized was by the mid to late 1960s, including, I would say for the entire decade, essentially, that television was providing this new platform by which to articulate oneself and discuss the freedom struggle. This is where we get that clip in the I'm Not Your Negro documentary, where Baldwin is taking on Paul Weiss, right? They're on TV having this discussion. And so, like Baldwin, Malcolm X was not physically engaged in activism, that the very activism that had become so critical to the 1950s and 1960s. But like Baldwin, he's going to speak out in protest, right? And speak out in protest on television. He's going to utilize this medium that had become so popular now by the 1960s. And the last chapter of my book investigates this point: Black leadership and Black masculinity on television as a medium and platform that was assuming greater popularity and influence in American public life in the 1950s and 1960s, but what that image could do as it's being transmitted across the country, if not the world, when it's removed from sort of a proper context. And by the 1960s, for the first time, some television programs were granting more time to Black commentators on racial issues than it ever had, pushed in a lot of ways by Black activism happening in the streets, of course. And so many of these television programs invited speakers onto shows to have discussions on the Black freedom struggle, right? And sometimes at length. Sometimes there were 15-minute discussions, sometimes 30-minute discussions. And this is significant. I mean, if we think back to the 1950s and 1960s, Television programming usually was in a 15 to 30-minute format. So to have a discussion that long about racial issues was significant. Malcolm capitalized on these unprecedented developments, displaying a certain model of Black masculinity through this very visible medium until his notoriety became a problem for leaders of the organization that he represented, the Nation of Islam. Malcolm became well known, if not infamous, for talking at length about the Black man, the white man, Black manhood, and what Black men should do to stand up and be men and what they should do for the race. And if they did this effectively, then the race would advance. So Malcolm thought. Malcolm achieved a kind of iconic status in this way, right? As a provocateur who made it plain by sensationalizing blunt rhetoric crafted in a lot of ways for TV audiences. But when tensions erupted between Malcolm and the Nation of Islam's leadership, precisely because of that iconic status, the Nation of Islam took the publication of the paper, Muhammad Speaks, away from Malcolm. The paper continued to be published, but under the direction now of another minister who was based in Chicago. Malcolm at the time was based in New York. When Malcolm eventually broke with the Nation of Islam in 1964, the nation responded by performing a rhetorical emasculation of Malcolm in order to attack him and discredit him before the very audiences he had come to represent such a proper and militant Black man. So here again, gender could be used to remove gender. That is, one can have complete, absolute manhood at one time and then lose it at another. Malcolm was characterized as an unmanly double-crosser. As one critic put it, Malcolm Little, Malcolm's last name before the X came along, right? Malcolm Little had become Little Malcolm. Throughout the book, I call these kinds of episodes contests of masculinity. That is, these moments in which deeply fraught and complex politics get settled through and reduced to this masculine discourse, right? Particularly in the context of a contest, a literal and figurative fight. This discursive elimination of a real or perceived rival by two or more men competing for leadership and influence over the public sphere and for the title of real men. How could this be? Right? Malcolm, the man who said aloud and unapologetically what Black people were thinking, the man who stood at the window with the rifle, right? That famous photo of Malcolm. So if Malcolm, who for many represented the certain ideal of proper Black manhood in the 1960s, of particularly a militant, if not revolutionary Black manhood, if he could be less than a man, right? We can imagine what happened to Baldwin, a gay Black man, faced or when he tried to speak out on behalf of the race, when Baldwin attempted to assert that role as a racial leader and intellectual. He was mocked by some as Martin Luther Queen, right? When the Black Power era exploded in the mid to late 1960s, others would have more to say in this regard. So take Eldridge Cleaver, for example. He was one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party. He had this to say, quote, "There is in James Baldwin's work the most grueling, agonizing, total hatred of the Blacks, particularly of himself, and the most shameful, fanatical, fawning, sycophantic love of the whites that one can find in the writings of any Black American writer of note in our time," end quote. So if you've ever read Cleaver's Notes on a Native Son, his piece attacking Baldwin, you'll notice that I decided here to quote the least provocative of Cleaver's statements as he went on to condemn Baldwin's sexuality in much harsher terms, striking the point that Baldwin did not measure up as a literary leader, as an intellectual, and as a man because he was gay, even going as far as to say that Baldwin was a happy, prostrate bedfellow of American letters, right? Put simply, one's sexuality can legitimize or compromise one's intellectual capacities and contributions. The Black Power era, on one hand, addressed the slow pace of protest strategies deployed by an older civil rights establishment, the pervasiveness of racism in America, police brutality and racial violence, colonialism, and state failures that maintained urban poverty and medical apartheid. On the other hand, wrapped up in all those politics I just named, we also see a set of deeply patriarchal, phallocentric, and heterosexist politics that subordinated women and condemned gay Black men and rejected both as unfit for proper racial leadership. Now, to be clear, Rustin and Baldwin's sexuality was not the sum of their identities, their subjectivities, their politics, or their existence. Rarely ever is that the case for any of us, right? That one thing defines all of who we are. But hegemonic frameworks like gender and masculine politics are usually uninterested in complexity and nuance and competing ideas and competing epistemologies. Still, Baldwin, the trenchant writer and social critic, responded to Cleaver's attack and did it simply. Quote, "In assaulting myself, the older Black male artist, Cleaver was also assaulting a part of himself." End quote. Baldwin would, of course, respond with more writing, as he had done in his work, responding to a myriad of problems that concern life and the world, problems in which gender is just one thing among many. But it is these things, race, gender, sexuality, among other categories of identities, that we believe now as much as people did then, that these are real and natural and immutable things. And even as we might take the examples I just provided and illustrated throughout this talk of Black people engaged in a set of ideologies and politics that limited Black liberation as much as it empowered it, right? We must also take into account the ways in which opponents of the freedom struggle engaged in the same kinds of ideologies, politics. So hopefully you saw the moments in the documentary, both on Baldwin and Rustin, where the federal government worked to target and exploit the sexualities of both men and others in ways that state authorities thought they could discredit and fracture the Black freedom struggle before white allies and audiences in America and around the world. You might recall from the documentary on Baldwin that the federal government is targeting him as, quote, a known homosexual, end quote. So put another way, officials in the federal government believed as much as certain Black men that there was indeed a proper manhood and that the display of anything but could be mobilized against Black people in their fight for citizenship rights, racial justice, and allies to those causes. Put simply, the state also promoted the same problematic masculine discourses to mark out the other and thereby throw up boundaries and barriers to their entry into mainstream American life, politically and otherwise. What these issues, questions, and tensions show us is that manhood is not natural. Rather, it is socially and historically constructed into an orthodoxy of thought that holds that one can be born a man, but not be a man. And to be a man, one must be made into a man. trained and disciplined to perform and enact a set of actions, discourses, ideologies, and politics that we deem representative of proper manhood, though what we deem as such changes over time, over region, over class, over race, sexuality, so on and so on, right? And if something assumed to be so natural changes that much, that often, how natural is it? And if any of us find all this utterly unbelievable, how could these historical actors have subscribed to these ideas? Then just consider the ways we continue to believe that people will achieve some form of rights, citizenship, value, legibility if they just stand up and affirm or reaffirm a proper gendered self. That is, if people just become real men and real women, then they will get the rights they deserve, right? And I think this is what the ever insightful Baldwin was trying to caution us against in his exchange with the Yale professor. I think he was cautioning us that in either case, man or woman, gay or straight, and anything in between, right? If the goal is to become a full man, then why is death the result when Black men in particular, and certain groups in general, attempt to present themselves as that, let alone as full human beings in all the complexities of human beings before the public, before the state? And this death could be literal or it could be social and political, a social death, right? In which one is exiled to a place where you exist without rights, without being. Why is it that the state will only recognize us if we present uh, ourselves or so-called proper selves in these terms? And even then still reject our claims on citizenship. Perhaps part of the problem is that the state and citizenship are as arbitrary and as constructed as race and gender. Or perhaps we try to hold on to a gendered ideology as one of the ways we can maintain what we think is some semblance of order before the constancy of state and market failures that are supposed to provide the rights that America promised. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much to Weston for such a thought-provoking lecture. We've received a lot of great questions and comments, both submitted during the registration process by SLU students, faculty, and staff, and we're getting some questions in to the live Q&A as well. Want to encourage people to submit their questions and comments to the live Q&A and continue to do so while we're here. I'll start with a couple of questions. One is, could you talk a little bit more about the evolution of Black masculinity in the period following the peak of the civil rights movement, after the assassinations, after the attacks on a lot of Black union-led activity, and with the increase of mass incarceration, especially of Black men, and spending a little bit more time, especially on the impact of mass incarceration and the not so new narrative that criminalizes Black men in the mass media, and how this narrative survives today and serves to take down Black men when necessary. You've already alluded to that some. And then the other question is, could you please share some of your favorite books about, besides yours, about and by Black men fighting for freedom in America from the era of slavery to contemporary times?
Yeah. So both great questions. So my book stops short of the 1980s, unfortunately, where you are especially going to see that rise in mass incarceration and the rise of the carceral state as a response to Black people's ongoing liberation struggles. So So what I'll say about that is, right, as I tried to illustrate with the talk, that um, ideas of Black masculinity and practices of it are going to change over time. It's never one thing at once, though the press and the media, as the question alludes to, is critical in sort of elevating one model over the other. Um, and I think in particular too that it's worth seeing mass incarceration as a response to the legitimacy of Black people's demands for the expansion of democracy, right? A greater understanding of rights. That if you look at Black political thought, do a close reading, you'll find that most of the time, when Black people are talking about the expansion of democracy, they're really talking about the expansion for everybody, not just Black people. The state responds and says, no, we want to contract that expansion of democracy, that democracy before the state, or in the opinion of state officials, tends to work better when you have less of it, right? And so mass incarceration becomes one of those ways to literally imprison Black people, their bodies, but also I think imprison the politics, the ideas of liberation more broadly, so that if uh, Black people are in the street marching, protesting, or trying to organize, that increasingly looks more criminal than it did, let's say, in the 1950s. So by the 1980s, um, you'll see this as especially a response to what the Panthers in the 1960s were attempting to do in organizing freedom schools, free breakfast programs, free medical care, for example. And so the state responded with the incarceration and the assassination of many of those leaders at the same time that they were had shifted many of their strategies to emphasizing more of a grassroots approach of freedom schools, free breakfast, free food programs, and free medical care. Um, to the second question, it's a tough one to answer. I'm going to miss a several number of scholars, but some that I would begin with in looking at questions of masculinity, Black masculinity in particular. Um, uh, Craig Wilder, his work, uh, Barbara Ransby, her work, Deborah Gray White, her work, um, Martin Summers, uh, Devin Carbardo, um, and maybe I'll we'll find a way to get some of those names. Maybe I can throw them in the chat, and if you didn't catch everything I said, but it is broadly to make the point that there are a number of scholars, that I am in conversation with, who have been making this argument about the complex ways we need to understand gender, masculinity, sort of writ large, but also womanhood, Black femininity, how the two work in conversation and in contestation. I think their work is brilliant in that regard in trying to take apart what we think, you know, uh, gender and masculinity is.
Great. Thank you for that. And yes, we'll follow up with you afterwards and we'll be sure to share um, authors' names and some book titles with folks in follow-up emails to registrants for this program. A couple more questions on the period covered in your book, and then we have a lot of great questions about current contemporary social crises of Black masculinity, relations between um, straight and LGBTQIA plus Black men, men and women. But first, a couple more questions on the Black freedom movement in that period.
Okay.
And this one question seems to go well with something you raised in terms of like the quote unquote public competition between Black leaders. And the person is wondering whether the robust debate and polemic about ideas of Black freedom between various Black male leaders and Black leaders generally serve to strengthen and diversify concepts and realities of Black manhood and masculinity and what it is to be a man. And maybe, and could you comment on the "I am a man" exclamation point protest movements in the late 60s that seem to indicate the growth and the strengthening of Black freedom, the Black freedom movement, and it's coming together with the labor movement just before King was assassinated, and things seemed to fall apart, and Black families and communities were attacked much more in the 70s. So you could talk about that.
Yeah. So trying to figure out where to start. So the Memphis sanitation workers who led that strike, and King would help support, and also this is where King was assassinated, as he was a part of that effort, as these men were fighting for safer work conditions, higher wages, trying to make an argument too about unionization, and invited King to their protest, and they donned these placards that said "I am a man," which was to make this point about labor, employment, rights, safety, that these sanitation workers shouldn't be discarded, that they were people, that they were men. But again, the language in which that is articulated, right, is "I am a man." So trying to illustrate the significance of the ways that we make claims on the state, and claims on rights, and claims on being human, fully human, taps into this gendered language to one, invoke this ideology, but also invoke a very palatable discourse for 1960s America. In many ways, we still do this today. That if we're trying to say what we're due as citizens, that some of that language is going to be rooted in and or cloaked in this gendered message. I'm trying to recall the other parts of the question. Could you remind me?
Sure. They're asking about the importance of robust debate about ideas of Black freedom from different perspectives, from different, I guess, Black leaders and their class stance, their political perspective, the communities they represent, and how that helped to strengthen and diversify concepts of Black manhood. So I guess that competition seemed to be good in that sense.
Yeah. So thanks. Right. So what I argue throughout the book is that both are happening. That you're going to get the empowering ways in which that competition produces that robust discourse about rights, about humanity, about race, so on and so forth, right? And then the ways in which it undercuts also, though, those same efforts to elevate discourses about rights and race and humanity. So you're going to get these really intense debates between, let's say, King and Robert F. Williams, or Malcolm X and King. And those are fruitful to an extent. They're all trying to figure out, what is the best method for producing racial justice. They differ over strategy, and to an extent, they differ over ideology. But a lot of those differences too, ideologically and otherwise, hinge on how we're going to present this to the public. And this is where the press becomes so critical, mass media becomes so critical. Black people have for a long time, I mean, as scholars reconsider the origins of the civil rights movement and continue to push the chronological origins back further and further and further. So now it's not just the 1950s. Now it was at one point the 1930s. Now it's the 1860s. Some other scholars are pushing it back to the founding of the republic, right? That some of these initial questions that activists in the 1960s would ask about, okay, the gaping hole between what America professes and what it does in reality, were being asked by Black people during the Revolutionary era. How can you fight for freedom and sort of frame that freedom as a fight against slavery, as many of the revolutionists did? There were Black people living at the time who were saying, okay, well, you have slavery in your backyard, though. How can we fight a revolution for freedom with this going on in our backyards? And so that's to make the point that these debates are going on. They're fruitful, they're intense, and they're also, no matter what leader we're talking about or what decade we drop in on, they're also trying to figure out how to make the argument they're making more palatable for the public to embrace, in hopes that they can win allies, build public support, and that will lead to the desired goal of racial liberation. And we can imagine how intense those debates get when you throw in this other element of like the audience. So we can understand why, Malcolm X, for example, is literally sitting before television audiences in a studio, and then audiences at home, as he's trying to figure out a way to present himself to white audiences, and then at other times to Black audiences. And if you look at clips of Malcolm doing this, there's a stark difference, right? King the same. So when King is speaking to Black audiences, different approach, as he would when he went on Meet the Press in the 1960s to talk about, for example, the March on Washington in '63. So they're all sort of calculating how to present themselves, and that attends to, that sort of shapes many of the discussions, debates, arguments they're having. And then some of the drawbacks of these arguments too, that as they're discussing complex political issues, they're also going to discuss those issues in these gendered terms, right? And this is where sometimes it becomes empowering, and this is where it also becomes problematic. That X, for example, is going to condemn King at a certain point in X's career. His language would change around the 64, late 64 and 65. But in his early public career, in the late 1950s, early 1960s, I mean, X is dogging King and the civil rights movement, nonviolent civil rights movement, in these gendered terms of, he's not a man, or this is compromising the masculinity of Black men. It's putting Black women and children at risk, and this, in a patriarchal society, is supposed to be the thing that real men defend, right? Their homes, their families, and so forth, right? And even that term, the possessive there, also raises some questions too, that you defend your woman, your children, and on one hand, so it raises a number of issues, I think, that they were all trying to wrestle with in ways that we still try to wrestle with today. And what's lost and gained as a result, well, what the contributions are, what the costs are. And so, yes, indeed, I mean, there were empowering ways to do it. But because of fights over who was going to be the leader and who was going to have the lead model, some of those empowering politics devolve into some problematic ones that cost the movement in different ways. And even removing it from the context of just men, right? Where King and Ella Baker, for example, had their arguments, and you could have gotten a more robust argument, as well as the question pointed out, sort of how robust the discussions were, but also you could have had a more robust leadership, right? That imagine that if we could have had a King and an Ella Baker, and Ella Baker being more visible at that time in the 1950s than she would be by the 1960s, talking about how we can comprehensively, with different perspectives, different ideologies, different approaches, attack this thing of racial injustice, and how much more that would have carried the movement forward.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a question from a live audience member. David asks, why do you think heterosexual cisgendered Black men continue to struggle with seeing and accepting masculinity within Black men who identify as members of the LGBTQI plus community? And maybe and to connect it to another question, Oliver's asking, how do you see how all Black men and actors and comedians have to dress up as women to succeed within the entertainment industry? So there's a feeling that there's some forced kind of feminization of Black men, and maybe there's some, some discussion between those two questions. And then I'll throw out another one. Frank asks, how do you think the tendency to avoid / deny discussions around mental health has impacted Black men?
Okay. So I think all of the questions have a lot to do with, as I tried to articulate with the talk, the regimes of power. And in this case, the regimes of gender as a function of power. That unfortunately, we, the country in different parts of the world, I think the same argument could be made that we operate on binaries, black or white, tall or short, gay or straight, right? And anything in between confuses us. We can't afford nuance. Regimes of power usually don't function in those kinds of ways of complexity. So I think part of to the first question, part of the reason cisgender Black men continue to struggle with not only recognizing other forms of masculinity, performances or lived experiences by Black men who might, let's say, be different from a standard model. I think has a lot to do with these regimes of power that you can only be one or the other. And if you aren't, then this costs all of us, right? I think also it returns to the one of the comments I made earlier about the ways in which Black folk are or have had to be hyper aware of audiences, and whether it's readers, whether it's viewers, I mean, increasingly in our moment today, viewers, and how do we transmit and articulate and perform a proper masculinity when there are onlookers, when there is a gaze, G-A-Z-E. And if you're trying to make a claim on rights, and that you have a sort of a proper, you're living a proper existence in order to make that claim and make that claim legitimate, then some of the people who participate in those politics want to police what is, again, seen as this difference, rather than, as I I tried to communicate with the talk, that there can be multiple models. They can all exist at the same time. And we can all also draw from those models what works, what we embrace, and we can critique and contest. We can also collaborate and build alliances. Um, and again, sort of thinking about, well, how can we make a more comprehensive movement that draws on everybody's ideas, everybody's leadership, everybody's contributions? Um, I think it requires us to really push past that binary that I think is such a pillar to Western frameworks and such a pillar to how power operates in this country as well as I think in the West. Um, I'm trying to think about the last two questions too. Could you remind me? I'm sorry. Um,
Yes, of course. More specifically, if you can discuss um, more about the relationship and the struggles of seeing and accepting Black men who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community by heterosexual cisgender Black men. Um, and you've touched on this already, but if you want to discuss that more specifically, and then also um, Oliver was wondering about kind of forced feminization of Black
right.
men in acting and comedy and um, to succeed within the entertainment industry.
Yeah. Again, how critical performativity is to gender, and that we are, whether you're on TV or not, if you're just walking down the street, all of this is a performance of something proper or thought to be proper, right? And and we're trying to enact these codes that I think follow, again, these regimes of power that will say to someone else, this is proper masculinity or proper womanhood or proper blackness or whatever, fill in the blank. Um, and when it isn't, for whatever reason, that uh, has the effect of um, sort of neutralizing one's claims on the state. And here's the contradiction too, that even if you achieve proper whatever in front of the state can still reject your claims. And so I think for that reason too, we're I think it begs this question of how useful is gender or any other category of identity to presenting oneself in sort of this legible, proper way to be recognized by the state if the state still maintains its own regime of power to negate, reject the claims you make. And I think that can be applied as it was for the first question about LGBTQ communities, as well as performances of Black people, Black men in on TV, on social media, any pick mass media, any facet of it. And there is a role, um, a framework, a trope that Black people are expected to play in a lot of ways. Um, that if they play something else, there's a problem with the character. There's the character doesn't resonate or register with us, the viewer, whether you're at home on your sofa or wherever, um, that we would recognize as the role that is supposed to be played by this person occupying that space. And I think the same point can also be applied to our everyday lives, right? So if we're not performing and playing the role, some onlooker expects us to play, or even ourselves, that might negate claims that we make on the state. And also, I mean, there are a number of scholars who do a great deal of work, brilliant work on performance and race, and the roles, literally and figuratively, that Black people are expected to play, have been expected to play historically, um, and when there's some kind of deviation, whatever that means, breaking with that role, they're then rendered illegible. Like, we don't recognize um, that character, um, whether that character is on screen or on the street.
Great. Maybe we'll take a couple more questions. This is a good segue from kind of what you were discussing in terms of the need to learn from different models, different examples. And it's a question about what are good resources and good examples, good models to learn from in terms of learning and forming and strengthening Black masculinities. There's one comment made about how in the military, Black masculinity is in question. Discipline and overcoming adversity prove competence and builds confidence. How can this model be translated into effective programs that build Black young men, I guess not necessarily in the military, into roles of masculinity that are supported by the community? Another audience member wonders, can a woman, a mother, teach a Black man how to become a man if there is no father figure in the home? Women, mothers are often looked upon to do that, to impart what it means to be a Black man, what Black masculinity means. What challenges do you think Black women face in doing this? And what would you recommend as a resource to Black women in this situation?
Mm.
And then, and one last, and these are all kind of tied to the question about resources and models. If you can talk about the importance of global comparisons and contrasts in terms of what Black men are doing around the globe. And I'll just add personally that I know in the 50s and 60s, the Black-led, Brown-led nationalist movements around the world were instrumental in sparking and pushing along what was happening here in this country and vice versa. So anything you could add in terms of resources, examples, the importance of models as pertains to the military, the struggles of Black women raising Black men, and global examples we may look to as resources and models.
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question, the one about the military. I want to push back just a little, that so the relationship between the American military and Black people and people of color writ large has been a complex one, a mixed bag in a lot of instances, especially if we're looking historically. I think only recently, and by recently I mean within the last 30 to 40 years, are you going to find Black people, men in particular, who aren't necessarily questioned on masculinity as much as they, I think, are still questioned on competence, right? I mean, when we look at leadership in the military, on one hand, it's not going to look terribly reflective of the country and the people who serve. At the same time that, on the other hand, the military has perhaps served as the better uh, institution of meritocracy for Black people than other institutions in American life. And so that's sort of the duality. And I say this too as a grandson of a veteran. You know, so part of it is that you know, if the military is going to serve as a model, I mean, I talked about Robert F. Williams, for example, who was a Marine, returned home, fought in the Korean War, returned home to North Carolina, and became an activist. E.D. Nixon, who was involved in the Montgomery bus boycott, was also a veteran, returned home, became an activist. Um, Bobby Seale, co-founder of the Panthers, was a Marine, returned home, became an activist. And so I think when we look at sort of that lineage or those historical moments, um, we see the ways in which the military has served as a politicizing force for Black people who serve, Black men in particular, in the ways that I just named, and the people I just named, and politicizing precisely because they're trained in to serve, whether as combatants or otherwise, sort of imbued with these nationalist ideals, and then return home to see that again, there's this gaping hole between what America professes and America's realities, and then they become activists, and so if not radicals, right? And so in those ways, I think the military could serve as this model for Black men, in the ways that it, on one hand, provides sort of stable employment, um, but also politicizes in this direction that I just identified. There can be drawbacks to that, though, especially if we think about the ways in which the American military has, I mean, served as a vehicle for nationalism, imperialism, occupying forces, um, and sort of you know, maintenance of regimes of power in American life and across the world. And so you know, again, I hesitate. Here's I guess the part of the pushback is where you know, the line should be drawn between um, the military as a support for the U.S. and its continued maintenance of its regimes of power, uh, and then the other side where you're trained by the U.S. military to, you know, in from that experience, you begin to ask questions about those regimes of power. You begin to critique those regimes of power, and you begin to, uh, um, you know, organize and mobilize against those regimes of power. Um, for can I think the question was, can Black women or mothers, you know, sort of teach uh, Black men or sons how to be men? And yeah, definitely. I say this as the son of um, a single mom who did that kind of work, and the labor involved in doing that kind of work. But also I think the question points to this idea that that again, we're going to make men, that we're going to uh, engage in this process of cultivating, building, constructing proper men, and that boy or young man or man, full grown adult, is going to accept um, and embrace the things that are being taught, instructed, or applied as the proper model. And I think it's worth reconsidering, um, you know, again, a singular model. I think multiple models are fantastic, especially when those models contest and critique one another. And we have to sort of wrestle with nuance and complexity. Um, I think Audre Lorde uh, is a great example of this, an activist, writer, um, who wrote to some extent about being a mother, Black woman, mother, and raising a son and trying to teach him manhood at the same time that she was also a Black lesbian mother warrior, right? I mean, these are things that she used to describe herself as this writer poet. Um, and um, again, I think having sort of that broad range of perspectives as a way to instruct someone on how to be X, like fill in the blank, how to be, how to achieve being in these categories of identity that may or may not, become critical to your existence on Earth, right, or existence in society. Uh, and so yeah, I think definitely one's gender does not preclude one's ability to engage in the processes that we think are critical to manhood. Um, and I try to illustrate throughout the book that there were a number of, as one scholar calls it, interested others. Interested others. There were a number of people involved in the process of constructing proper Black masculinity at different times in different places. And so it ranged from Black men themselves to Black women to white people, white men, white women, to children, Black children, white children, and so on and so forth, right? And all of these people who are contributing um, in helpful ways and also in critical ways, like to critique, to contest, to challenge, and that would produce new discourses, that would produce adjustments. What worked, let's say in 1919, as I tried to point out in the talk, what worked in 1919 may not work in 1955. What worked in 55 may not work in 2024, right? And so it requires, I think, this ongoing effort. There's also this ongoing prevailing belief that manhood is always in crisis. This is the case for Black men in America. This is the case for white men also in America, right? And again, no matter what decade we drop in on, there's someone making an argument about a crisis happening. And the idea is the response to resolving that crisis is going to be a proper assertion of manhood, of proper manhood. And that may or may not be how you solve crises. And the crisis itself, if there is one, could be far more complex than just gender alone. But again, some of our responses are that we need a real man to answer the problem. And then that will, we think, produce a positive outcome. And so we see this happening in some discussions around, for example, one of the questions about Black men in incarceration. We see it also in, as Trump, as sort of representing a certain kind of masculinity for certain men, that he's going to restore a lost manhood, in addition to, sort of lost era of American greatness. And sometimes the two are together, American greatness and a proper manhood. And that has appeal, like that attracts followers as we see. So there's a discussion about it happening, in our modern moment, no different, I think, in ways that you would find, to point back to one of the earlier questions, X and King going at it, or Bayard Rustin going at it with Malcolm X. They actually had a debate that you could pull up a YouTube clip of the audio. James Baldwin, who would also have a discussion with Malcolm, and you'll hear these men talk about race, politics, rights, the movement, and then at some point, manhood. And how manhood was part of, attending to this greater discussion of rights. And for those men who are talking, they don't see them as separate. That you can't be the real man that we need to be if you lack rights. And they're responding in 1965 or 1925, as it was for Garvey, in 1915, as it was for Robert Abbott of the Chicago Defender. They're responding to this real and perceived crisis that something is being lost, and one way to gain it back is through a proper manhood.
DeWeston, thank you so much for today's talk. I think we've come to time, but this has been so incredible, and thank you to our audience that took the time to join us today. As Michael mentioned, and thank you to Michael for sharing out questions. We will follow up both with access to the recording of today's program and also some resources that have been shared, and certainly books and scholars that DeWeston has shared as part of today's conversations. We'll follow up with attendees. And again, for SLU students and alumni, please do email so we can make sure we get a copy of DeWeston's book into your hands. Thank you again. This has been such a pleasure. And to everyone, keep a lookout for our emails and our newsletters with additional upcoming programs we may have this semester, and certainly when we, kick back up into full steam again in the fall semester. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.